Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm guessing we are now live. Thank you for joining us today. Uh, and just to quickly open this discussion, I think for all of us who've been working in the cybersecurity industry, ensuring the security of our software, the software that we make, software that we buy, has always been paramount. But recent events have shown that perhaps some of the ways in which we think about software security and product security uh, is perhaps insufficient. An example, software poisoning by attackers can go undetected, leading to a compromise of hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations that use that software, as many recent notable events have taught us. Then also the building blocks of the code that we use in our software to create new features faster, to ship our software faster, whether those building blocks are open source code or blocks of code that are purchased through from third-party developers. Again, as some of the recent case studies illustrate. And as it turns out, in many cases, we know very little about that software base that we use in our products. And software supply chain is many things to many people, but I think we can distill it to a couple of key components. One is the code that ultimately makes up the software. The second one is all of that plumbing, the infrastructure, and the pipelines through which the code traverses. And today, I look forward to spending some time with our panelists discussing how we can make it all more secure and more resilient. And pleased to introduce our terrific panelists today. Mitch Herkus is with us. He's the branch director for federal cybersecurity within the Office of Management and Budget. Mitch leads cybersecurity initiatives within the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer. And some of his responsibilities include government-wide implementation of the President's executive order on cybersecurity. Also with us today is Tim Brown. Tim Brown is the Vice President of Security for SolarWinds, with the responsibility spanning internal IT security, product security, and security strategy. Tim has over 20 years of experience developing and implementing security technology. He has a trusted advisor status, which has taken him from meetings with members of Congress and the Senate to the Situation Room in the White House. Also with us is Nitzan Ziv. Nitzan is the CEO and co-founder of Ox Security, the first end-to-end software supply chain security solution for DevSecOps. Prior to that, he was the VP of cybersecurity for Checkpoint, where he oversaw all internal cybersecurity initiatives. His team responded to major cyber attacks, working closely with Interpol, local certs, and other enforcement agencies. And finally, with us today is GT's own Jitendra Joshi. He's a director in our software security practice. Jiten is a former head of information security and product security with a technology company. He has over 20 years of holding roles in technical strategy and leadership capacity, including fast-growing technology companies. Again, welcome to the podcast. To the webcast today. Super excited about the conversation. And I guess as a way to get started, Mitch, maybe I'll go to you with a first couple of questions. As someone who's representing the federal government as the buyer of software on behalf of various agencies in the federal government, can you provide us an overview of the executive order 14028 and the White House memo that was published just about a month ago, I believe?
Sure. So Executive Order 14028 is better known as the President's Executive Order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. It involves a lot of different elements, everything from how the federal government reorganizes itself around zero trust to threat information sharing to a wide litany of other things as well. When it comes to secure software, there is an entire section on it, Section 4, which is kind of an alphabet soup of different actions that the federal government is going to take. Goes all the way from A to X. Some of them have been in the news recently, including the IoT labeling that initiative that has been kicked off, which will kind of present to organizations an opportunity to meet certain standards for cybersecurity when it comes to IoT devices, and similar to an Energy Star type label, kind of put something on it that says this IoT device meets certain standards. We are trying to ensure also that when the federal government, looking at our zero trust initiatives and all of that, is utilizing a secure software and a secure software supply chain. As I said, there's A through X, many steps in there. But the latest executive order, and there have been, latest OMB guidance, and there have been many that have come as a result of the executive order, has been, on building a secure software development pipeline and enhancing the security of the software leveraged by agencies. Section 4K of the executive order really told agencies they had to implement the NIST standards that were put out to ensure that there's a secure software development framework in place that covered how agencies were developing in-house software. But the latest one, M2218, really says, okay, now when you get software through a software producer, it should be built to certain minimum requirements within that secure software development framework. So that is the intent there, and we have are building out the processes now for how, who that applies to, what instances that applies to, and how we ensure that moves forward in a way that is both raising the bar and reducing risk across the federal enterprise, but also, in addition to that, ensuring that the code that underpins everything we do, all the services we deliver as the federal government, continues to move forward. So we're trying to set that bar in the right place to ensure we move forward in the right way and iterate from there.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. And I'm certainly very glad to hear that the federal government is taking a very focused, very intentional approach to procuring software. So for maybe some of the software producers that are on the webcast and listening to the recording afterwards, that either do business with the federal government or are hoping or looking to enter that market, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about, some of the things they should be doing as federal agencies begin implementing that guidance in the memo that you just talked about?
Sure. So I should point out that this is really something that applies to new software going forward. So anything that following the issuance of the act they should be kind of thinking through how they map their work to the secure software development framework. OMB will be soon issuing minimum requirements within that framework that all software producers doing business with the federal government will need to meet on products moving forward. But if you are, entering into an agreement as a software producer on something that's not, this doesn't apply to open source software. We're tackling that separately because, understandably, you can't really have a relationship there in the same way as you do with a software producer who you might be contracting with in another way. But the goal here is to ensure when you do have that relationship, and it's being developed after the issuance of the memo, you're really meeting these minimum requirements. And agencies are going to be kind of working with their software producers and putting out more information on that if you already have a contract there. But I think a good first step is looking at the secure software development framework, see how that maps to what you're doing now. And then as the minimum requirements come out, which should be happening within the next coming months, take a look at those, ensure those are incorporated into your efforts as well. And that's the starting point, really.
I think that's very helpful. And Mitch, before I come back to you with another question, I was hoping to get Tim Brown's perspective, as the CISO of an organization that is selling products and have customers in the federal government community, both civilian and defense. How are you thinking about this executive order and some of the guidance that's been coming out of OMB in terms of being prepared to meet those requirements when they become a reality?
Yeah, so I think the requirements are right now pretty reasonable, right, when we look at them, right? They're trying to give both a perspective of the company and then also a perspective on how you develop software, right, and where you go. One of the things that I like to think about kind of from a supply chain perspective is kind of both little supply chain and big supply chain. So when we think about, when, Sunburst came out, so, my incident, right, we initially said it was a supply chain attack because they didn't affect our source code, right? Somewhere between source code and product, it was affected. Ended up being part of a transient virtual machine that had code inserted into it. So first days, we coined that a supply chain attack. But then secondarily, when we looked at our customers, what they termed a supply chain attack was, since we had tainted code that was shipped, we were in the middle of other things, other entities' supply chains. And that's really where it became apparent that we need something different. Right? We also need scoring that's different, because we didn't necessarily get paid attention to as a critical component because of the spend somebody was making as part of their critical supply chain. How can a component, when you've got $1 billion or multi-million-dollar supply chain, how can this one little component that costs, $25,000 be a critical component? And so cost wasn't necessarily what was important when we look at the pieces in the big supply chain. So, from that perspective, all the conversations we're having now, a lot of them resulted from, kind of that model and saying, okay, well, why didn't we know about it? What didn't we know? What did we know? And then how can we appropriately evaluate software as it's built, appropriately evaluate what components make up a piece of software and the vulnerabilities that exist. But back again, it's not just about vulnerabilities, it's really about exploitability of those vulnerabilities. So it's important that we take into context that a vulnerability upon itself in a library is not necessarily exploitable, not necessarily a risk. So it's important we don't just take the easy route and say, oh, it's a vulnerable component, fix it first, right? Oh, it's a vulnerable component, but, it sits, 3 levels deep and I'm not using the functions within it, and it's really not truly exploitable. So we have to be able to have that conversation and be able to provide the right amount of data so that people can truly assess risk. And that can be good for the vendor community, and it can be good for the consumers of the vendor's product. So I think from a vendor perspective, we see this as a move in the right direction, a move to mature our software, a move to mature the software for everyone. But we have to take it in the right way so that we have, we're solving practical risks, not theoretical risks.
That's right. I think that's right, Tim. I appreciate that perspective, and I'll have a couple of follow-up questions for you in just a few minutes. Mitch, so, some of the things that I'm hearing for software producers that are doing business with the federal government are concerns, frankly, that, maybe they won't be able to meet those minimum requirements. And what does that do for their business model? What would be the message that you would give them?
Yeah, so look, we're trying to make these as eminently reasonable as possible. And we've reached out, just to kind of back up a bit, both in crafting the guidance as well as in this area where we're crafting the minimum requirements. We've talked with people within government that are, we've talked to agency leaders on the IT side. We've talked with acquisition officials. We've talked with the broader community. And then we've also talked with our private sector partners about this as well, and technologists and those on the procurement side from the private sector. And of course, the legal side, because in the end, this is going to be a self-attestation signed off on at the C level. That means that the lawyers have to be comfortable with it as much as the software engineers, right? So we have to have a lot of parties look at this and say, this is a reasonable document. These are things we can achieve. So we're taking it from that approach. We're seeing how much we can reduce the risk while keeping a reasonable thing in place that will really not do anything to damage the broad and diverse marketplace that's necessary to ensure the federal government's able to do its work. I would say, in a worst case scenario, there may be instances where there are waivers and extensions available. It's going to be a high bar. this has to be signed off on by the director of the Office of Management and Budget. So it's not exactly something that an agency can do offhand. It has to have a real case-by-case, limited time reference, kind of approach to saying that, this is a critical piece of software and we are doing the right things to get it into the right place or in the interim. So, if there is a continuous development software that's critical underlying the government and they just need another month to get in place a certain element of the minimum requirements, there may be an instance where they can essentially get granted an extension on their time to get good on that. So there is a bit of a release valve there, I would say, but it will be used sparingly because our intent is to make this something that if software producers aren't meeting right now, they certainly can get there.
Appreciate it, Mitch. Yeah, and agree that, with Tim and the points that you're making, that some of the initial guidance that's coming out of OMB, really reasonable minimum baseline of security to assure that the software that's being used by the government to deliver services is secure. So I think that certainly would put, a lot of minds at ease. Another question for you, Mitch. There's been a lot of noise over the last, year and a half around the software, this whole concept of software bill of materials, or the SBOM, as we call it. Where does that fit into the whole picture?
So SBOMs are somewhat optional under this. The deal is that we're creating this minimum standard self-attestation form. We're encouraging agencies to utilize that as much as possible. We'd like it to be a kind of one and done thing wherever reasonable, right? So if an agency has a piece of software that's low risk, it's something they're utilizing in their environment, they don't have it's not a critical piece of software necessarily, it's just something they use perhaps, maybe this minimum requirements should be enough for most things, right? And that means that it can have reciprocity across agencies. It can be put up on a software producer's website and downloaded by their customers. That's the goal there. Now, of course, there are going to be pieces of software that's more critical, and we're going to want to hold it perhaps to a higher bar. Agencies have the discretion to decide that they are going to want certain artifacts, including perhaps a software bill of materials, to guarantee a higher, to guarantee they understand a bit more about that software. And if there was some sort of, let's say an open source vulnerability, they might be able to look at that, recipe cookbook, so to speak, and look at it and see if it's something that they should be concerned about without necessarily having to reach straight out to the vendor and have that conversation. So it helps them understand a little bit more about their environment, especially when they may be positioning certain software in a critical position. However, it is not required in all instances. Oh, I should also mention that, we are ensuring that agencies don't get too far afield, that they are adhering to kind of the standards, that standard SBOM structures that are, put in, that have been kind of sanctioned by NIST. So we're trying to maintain some level of consistency there, understanding that this is a growing and maturing field.
Yeah. Hey, Mitch, one question, right? So is the federal government ready to receive all of this data? Do they know what they're going to do with it? Because you're going to put a lot of cost and effort to the vendors of the world. And just think about what this means. If somebody's doing a release like a SaaS product 10 times a day, do you want to see 10 of them? Probably not.
No.
But are you going to be able to eat through an SBOM for Windows, right? Are you going to? So that's the other half of it. And that's what we have on the private sector when we talk about SBOM. It's like, well, we don't have a person assigned to this. We don't have a team assigned to this. We have to go hire people in order to absorb these things. So with these directives, are you ready to absorb them?
Yeah, Tim, that's a great
Mitch,
point.
Maybe I'll ask you to pause for just 1 second. I'm going to bring our first polling question. That's the first out of the 4 that's required for those in attendance to receive the CPE. So while folks are absorbing the question and some of the options that we provided, Mitch, I'll go ahead and respond.
Sure.
Tim, great question.
No, so Tim, certainly that's something that we've discussed a lot and thought about in crafting M2218. For one, we require that agencies build a plan around that to start, and how they plan to process these and how they plan to work through these, and ensure that they also have a plan for staff, right? As you mentioned, having the capacity and expertise to do that. That's the short-term version of this. Long-term, there is within the guidance a requirement that CISA start building a repository. And that repository is supposed to be a searchable database that allows for a centralized place for this that's both not only secure, but allows for, if there was, say, an open source vulnerability or some sort of code that may be packaged up with other code, they'd be able to search through that and look through that. And agencies would also have a centralized, secure place to, and software producers, frankly, to know that this is where things were being stored in a certain manner that they felt good about. Now, obviously, we want to ensure that from day one, things are secured in the right way, in the right manner, and that agencies are asking for what they need. The self-attestation itself, what we're really asking for off the bat in the vast majority of cases, is going to be pretty much a two-page type thing. If they are asking for SBOM, so we are working with agencies to ensure that they know what they're asking for here and why they're asking for it, and in what manner and what ways would be actionable for that, right? It's not just something to ask for to have, per se, but because you need it for certain specific information, specific instances.
Thanks, Mitch.
Great.
And I see we're at 72%. Let's see if we can get to 90% in the next 60 seconds or so. And Nitsan, maybe I'll pass it over to you now that we're talking about the topic of SBOM, and putting aside some of the concerns that very valid concerns that I think Tim brought up is how do you manage the SBOMs? How do you track the vulnerabilities or the pieces of information that's contained in the SBOM on a continuous basis? But at a high level, a standard SBOM, what does it tell us about a given application or the organization that produces it?
Okay. So imagine an SBOM to be a spreadsheet. It has 4 columns: open source dependency name, the version, the license, and the known vulnerabilities. Now, in normal organization that we work with, this list can be 100,000 lines long. And I think Tim brought up a good point, which is if you need to scan through this list, you need to understand what are you actually looking for. Now, most organizations that do scan right now for SBOM are going to find throughout those 10,000 or 100,000 or a million lines of SBOM, they are going to find issues within them. Now, since it is a dependency of their dependency, they can't really do with it anything. So they don't really understand what are they expected to do at this stage, or if there's a fix available. Now, the challenge is that if you take all the recent software supply chain and you apply SBOM and try to understand, okay, let's say that I've got a proper SBOM and I've done a really, really good job in ingesting it in and just getting it fully understood, somebody's working and adjusting it. The problem will be that it will cover probably about 5% of the current software supply chain attacks from the recent years. So if you look on, let's say, the last 2 years, I think that only 3 cases would have actually been getting some help to find them within the SBOM framework. So the SBOM itself, I think it's a great start by saying we need to have visibility, but the visibility just on open source dependency by itself, I don't think that's enough to actually have some kind of a prevention mechanism versus the next attacks. So my expectation is we're going to continue to see the same attacks happening over and over again in and outside the federal environment.
Nitsan, point well taken, I think. So given what you said, what are some of the other artifacts that could be generated programmatically or in a way that's automated and a low level of manual effort and manual involvement that could tell more of the story, both about the particular piece of software that's being purchased and perhaps about the organization that's developing that software from the security standpoint.
Okay, so if you look on traditional software development methods, 20 years ago, we used to work waterfall. So once a year, a big release, a lot of content coming in, no predictability. As the world progressed, we moved towards agile development and then to continuous integration, continuous development, and continuous deployment, And you get to the point that you want to reduce the amount of effort between versions to actually understand what is the gap. I think that the same methodology needs to apply towards software supply chain. So you need to capture for every build all the way, what are the risks, what are the posture of the environment that you're building, what is the posture of the artifacts that you're creating, your code repository. The Toyota hack that just happened a week ago was an artifact, a Git repository that was open since 2017, exposed to the internet without anybody even noticing it. So even if you had the proper SBOM, it doesn't matter because the entire code is simply leaked out there. And you can go case by case and understand this. So at least by my philosophy, the way to do it is constantly capture everything that is going on in your environment, starting with the Jira ticket to the Git repository, Git posture, development and procedures of the proper development, going to the CI/CD, to the artifact registry, to the deployment zone, to the CADN that actually hosts things, and ensure the integrity of the software from the beginning to the end, and that it went through the right process. But it can't be a process that happens once a year. It needs to be continuous. It needs to be embedded into the program. And going back to what Tim just said, yes, if we're releasing a software 10 times a day, then yes, you should be able to declare 10 times a day of what are you doing. I think it opens a different question, which is, let's say I'm able to provide to you 10 times a day, what am I going to do? As Tim said, nobody's going to consume this and actually understand what am I expected to do. And I think that there is a different kind of solution saying, what if we can create some kind of a smart contract saying, as a software consumer, I might be government, I might be private, this is my set of expectation, and I can apply this digital certificate or digital assurance or coin to the automatically generated pipeline bill of material, which captures everything that goes through the pipeline, and you can get a Boolean answer saying yes, no. And it is the vendor's responsibility to say, if I've got something that needs declaration, somebody with an executive level within the company needs to take accountability and say, I'm excluding this for X amount of time. So the actual burden of proving that the software is correct goes back to the software vendor. They are the only ones that can actually fix the problem. It's not the consumer side that needs to be the owner of the problem itself. Hope it makes sense, Max.
No, appreciate it. Thank you, Nissen. I'm going to read a question from one of the audience members, and Mitch, I think it's directed to you, although it doesn't say so. And I think I know the answer, but would love you to take a stab at it. So the question goes as follows. Do we speculate that future legislation or interpretation of the current legislation will evolve beyond self-attestation to requiring an independent assessor to attest to the controls, be that second line of defense, for example, security governance or risk departments, third line of defense, which is internal audit, or an external third party?
So as of now, I'll answer this in kind of a roundabout way, and I apologize for that because I wouldn't want to speculate on what Congress would do at any point. But I will say that, as things are today within the federal government, we are focused on this self-attestation. We believe that having a C-level executive sign on the bottom line of something to the federal government, attesting that their corporation or organization is doing certain things is a pretty big act. And we hope that software producers would take that seriously and the C-level executive would take that seriously. beyond that, I think it's important to note that, the current guidance has in it that agencies may ask for a third-party attestation. In some places, I think this actually benefits the provider. So, if you are a FedRAMP cloud, platform, we have it set up so that you can have a FedRAMP 3 PAO essentially do this third-party attestation for you, and for that to substitute for a self-attestation. So, especially if you're packaging together a lot of different softwares and some of that's open source, maybe it behooves you to kind of have that third party to provide that extra layer of care and understanding, and then you can have that when you go to agencies. In addition, agencies can say, these other third-party assessors are also valid, and we would accept that from them. And they may ask that of certain agencies in certain instances, such as critical software. So, there is the opportunity now for it to be taken to that level. However, we're not requiring it. We want to see how it works at this level. This is an opportunity to really iterate and see what works. But I certainly don't think it's a lower standard. The expectation should be that companies are doing their due diligence when they're kind of signing something for the federal government.
Yeah. So Mitch, with the due diligence that you're talking about, from a CISO perspective, I want certification, right? Just like our CFO wants SOX, right? Because that's what you're asking us for. So whether you realize it or not, you're saying, well, we've signed on it. We're serious about it. We are now responsible for it. And you're making us responsible for it without the control around being responsible. So you're saying a CFO is responsible for financial, but then you give them structure around that outside that says, yep, you're responsible, but it's your auditor that's responsible. And if you lie to your auditor, that's different, but you've got a structure. And what you're putting in place for the CISO has no structure. So it puts me at much greater risk. So just a soapbox little thing, but your statement there said, right? And it's true, right? It's not, but it has the CISO community very nervous. We'll just say that.
Okay. Well, I would hope that the CISO would weigh in and determine whether they felt they had the right controls in place to monitor and ensure these sort of these things were being met.
Right. But as you said, they're now responsible. So that level of responsibility is something that we take very seriously. So it's one that I think that, you should go back and have it. Think about it from the perspective of the CISO, that statement, right? And think about what that means. And responsibility without structure, without control, without audit is in many ways unfair, right?
Yeah.
I think that's, Tim, that's a terrific insight and really, really good input. And Mitch, maybe it's like, last thing, Mitch, before I move back to Tim, I have a number of questions. I know there's a forum within the OMB where industries is able to participate and provide the kind of feedback and input that Tim just provided you. How can industry get involved? Is you still thinking through, the actionable steps of implementing that guidance?
Oh, so we did have an open forum. We had industry workshops, and we had a number of various ways, and we had an open inbox for a while on this. Right now, we're kind of in the final crafting stages of the minimum requirements and the attestation. Certainly, we are hoping that, we've gotten a lot of excellent feedback from industry as well as, general public, nonprofit organizations, and internal to the government. Our hope is to make sure it's something that everyone can agree is, a reasonable document. So,
thanks, Mitch.
That's the expectation.
Appreciate it. So, Tim, back to you. I know you've been very actively speaking about the event that occurred to SolarWinds and some of its customers, nearly 2 years ago at this point. But in case some of those in the audience haven't heard you in other forums, and question from me is, can you describe what were some of the controls that maybe were missing, or which of the controls may have failed that allowed the threat actors to weaponize Orion in the way that they did 2 years ago?
Yeah, so, the threat actor that attacked us was Russian SVR, right? And, you're dealing with a nation state against a small company. And when you look at the amount of resources, Microsoft says 1,000 people behind the attack. So it's a very different level of an attack that the things for best practices for, software development are really not going to catch, what they did for us here, unless you get to, kind of complete audit from a line of code all the way through to the, end product, unless you do things like what we've done from a, triple build process to make sure that, we're building multiple times, we're comparing results, and making sure that you'd need collusion to affect our build again. They didn't do something simple like attack our GitHub, and where we always have checks and balances in there. So just the attack that they did, even with the best practices that are defined, those best practices are not going to protect you against everything, right? They're not going to protect you from an actor that, spends a good deal of time, studying your environment, understanding where to insert, being quiet, being stealthy. It can make it harder, right? But do we expect everybody to be able to do, full assume breach? Do we expect everybody to be able to do multiple for every release? Do we expect everybody to have that expense? It's really not fair from a general public perspective or a general company perspective. Do I think, meeting the basics were met, prior to the incident, but how do you go beyond that, right? How do you go beyond the basics to being, having, resilience beyond things that are capable to thwart a nation state, right? So I think the bar that has been set is reasonable bar, right? It is, your software best practices, self-asserted, development best practices. So there's nothing in there that you call out and say, hey, this wasn't met for this level of an attacker, right? So that's the one thing you have to understand. There's always risk in a system. Nothing is 100% perfect. There's, as I say, if you take over 3 of my people and have 3 insider threats, one of them being one of my architects, I only have 2 people responsible for the full build or for the final build. So if you could take over those, could you still do that? And is it possible? Sure. Anything is possible, right? With enough money, time, effort. So we just simply make it harder and harder and harder for, threat actors of any type to be able to, circumvent your controls.
No, that makes sense, right? I mean, given the motivated and well-resourced attackers, right? If one approach fails, they will experiment and find one that works.
They will do something else, right? So that's sometimes what we deal with, but that's not what you normally deal with from an attack perspective. So it's usually not that level of sophistication. But, so I'm a big fan of the work that we're doing to get to more, lessen the risk inside of our supply chain, lessen the risk and increase the visibility. No question. We provided quite a bit of input through, partners as well as ourselves to the process. So I think we'll get it right. It's just going to be an iterative process to, move through. But any reduction in risk is a good reduction. So we have to think of it from that perspective as well.
So Tim, maybe I'll ask you to put kind of the software buyer hat that Mitch had on through most of this webcast. Is, what would be, are there any questions that buyers of software can be asking from their suppliers that would help them mitigate some of those risks, or whether, it's something that SolarWinds experienced or others?
Absolutely. So, one of the large government customers, right? They asked me, during the incident, 12 questions. Those 12 questions are how we protect our environment, how do we build software, what do we use to scan software, what are our steps to build things, and asked those types of questions. And we didn't answer them in a short form, we answered them in a long form, right? And it really gave them a sense of, okay, this is how you build software. So getting to the context of how you build software, getting the context of what your company does and your products do, and not expecting absolute perfection everywhere, because absolute perfection just doesn't exist in software, right? We can get to reasonable, but new vulnerability pops up tomorrow. So, okay, then how do I processes and procedures to handle that? But perfection should not be our necessary goal. It should be, how much risk do I face with it? So those types of things are what we implement towards our vendors now when we're evaluating our vendors. The key is, though, that you make it so that it's consumable. My team handles our vendor questionnaires, and we get about 700. And if you know how many customers went through and asked questions about them and had conversations, it was about 10% at most. Yeah, so that's the kind of level we are from the consumer side is not necessarily looking at the data in the right way either. So it's a combination of vendors providing data and consumers actually having the capabilities to absorb that information and ask the right questions.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And the polling question that actually we just posed to our audience is, as buyers of software, do you require any of the following from suppliers of your business career-like applications? And we're at about 75% now, and I'm going to flip to our responses, and all of the panelists can see what we have received from the audience. I guess I would just open the floor to see if anybody wants to chime in on what we're seeing on the screen.
I think it's great that, it seems to be all over the place, which I think is a reasonable thing considering the maturity here, right? We're all kind of moving in this journey together. This is not something that there has been a consistent industry standard around for a long time where it's all moving together. So I think it's great. I think it's interesting that there's a large other there too. I think it just speaks to the fact that we're continuing down this path. And it probably is pretty case specific, I would suspect, for some.
Yeah, so one of the things that we always get, just one of the things that we normally get is a stake.
Go ahead, Tim.
Oh, I was just saying, one of the things that vendors normally get is a standard information gathering document that's been around for years. And that's usually the starting point for a lot of vendor evaluation. It's about 250 questions. And that's kind of the standard model that many use from evaluation.
Nielsen, I think you were trying to speak.
Yeah, I was actually saying that right now we see that 31% actually voting on G, other. And that's actually very intriguing. So it is not as a station, it is not SBOM, it's not VEX, it is not manual. So I'm wondering if somebody can share with us what is other in this case.
Yeah, and welcome audience to chime in the Q&A box. Definitely a great question.
Hey, Max, I think I'll jump in here. This survey response and the other option really demonstrates what Tim was talking about and what Mitch touched upon, that this is still a growing area, which requires a significant amount of training and awareness, both on the maker side and on the consumer side, especially on the consumer side, because makers, a lot of them, or many of them have been in the head, kind of leading the way, as Tim was mentioning from his company's point of view and various others, as we've seen in various other forums. But on the consumer side is, how do you define software supply chain? what's the risk of that? And where do you, within your organization, does that fit in? Does that fit in your third-party risk management? Under the question is, well, they have been there for some time. So what's new here and the understanding around that. And to build on that, something, again, the panelists talked about is, even if you get the software supply chain or SBOM or artifacts, how are you going to process it? Given the vendor ecosystem and the changes that are happening in today's or modern software development processes.
Appreciate it, Jitin, and yeah, totally agree. And maybe the last point of discussion for the webcast, we'll see how we're doing on time, that I'll open up to the panel is, look, for many of us who've lived in or have, had some role in the application security space, we've seen this attempt, what we're calling shift left, shift security further left into engineering. And, I think many of us will agree that, some of those attempts have probably been less than successful. In some cases, it's been tough to shift left effectively and successfully. I think one of the reasons is that, the more you shift that workload and around security into engineering, there naturally develops this friction between the two teams, between the engineering teams and between the security teams. And, as we talk about managing software supply chain security risks, that's, probably as far left as you go in this shift left kind of conceptual model, right? You're going to the source code that you're using in your applications, whether it's open source or other packages. So other, more effective models that maybe we should be contemplating to make the shift left successful as we think about software supply chain security risks. And perhaps the bigger question is there an opportunity to reimagine the role of the CISO within that paradigm?
So I'll go first. We should put up a polling question again so that people get their credit here. They need another one. Perfect. There we go. So in many ways that for when we're dealing with especially high volume agile development, multiple builds all the time, we have to be able to allow flexibility, allow people to move quickly, right? So that's kind of shifting left some of our responsibility, but we still can put guardrails in. And those guardrails are so important from a CISO perspective, is to be able to have those guardrails defined, what they are, when people can go out of those guardrails, still have monitoring, of course, still have audit, of course, still have all of those things that protect us, but allow people to move fast with appropriate guardrails within policy. So it's shift left in the right way because a single group and a single CISO group can't do everything. So I am a fan of shifting left, but with appropriate guardrails defined so that I can enable more people to do things securely while not trusting that they will do them securely, right? So having audit, having red team, having other things that are making sure that people are doing what they say they're doing, and then if they break through that, then we step in. So that's kind of one effective way of shifting left inside of a high velocity engineering environment.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take it in a different direction. I think.
Yeah, same here, Nixon. I'll go. I tried 3 times. Hey, and I think this is the part that is very, very interesting. Because traditional security mindset has been of a protector of value, protector of brand, protector of compliance and things like that. But when you come to software supply chain risks, this is truly an existential threat for many of the software makers. it doesn't matter, depending on the size and how you look at it. And I'm talking beyond executive order, which is, hey, if you're a federal selling to the federal government, then you have to comply with it. But more than that, if you look at the events of last 1 year, there has been a significant rise in software supply chain risks and attacks. And not many of them, or not all of them, have come from nation states actors. Just few enthusiasts and few well-organized groups have made some of these attacks very possible. And what that means is, how does a CISO or within the team, within the company, you're thinking about shifting left? Guardrails, yes, absolutely, everybody agrees. But what does the guardrail really mean? I think that's where the friction starts coming in, where you have the engineering mindset or the engineering organization or the builders, where they have a certain view of what is required or what can be versus security. Yeah. And that's where the enabling piece really
I didn't say it was easy. Yeah. I didn't say it was easy and I didn't say it was easy or non-contentious. So, but yes, absolutely. So we have a healthy contention on flexibility and kind of security and where we fit. So it is the adjustment of those guardrails, right? To be for certain things, where are you comfortable?
Yeah, and Nisan, I would love to hear your perspective on, maybe some of the effective way of managing that friction between, friction that's, in some ways inevitable, in some ways it's natural, but what are some of the ways to manage that friction so that it's has a positive outcome from your perspective?
So I think that the friction starts from a decision, a management decision saying whether security is important or not important. And it directly translated whether you've got the budget to do the proper education, create the right culture that adores security, and then you can shift left. If you're just trying to take a product and say, you know what, I'll just bring the results to developers and they will pick it up. Well, we're working with a few hundreds of customers, and I must say that we have a very, very clear sample set saying if there is no support, there is no events for the developers, endorsing security, building the right guild, building the right, it will not work. It doesn't matter what tool you're going to bring in, whether it's ID plugin, the developer will remove it. If it is build pipeline and mechanisms like this, they will build their own Git. We've seen so many different creative ways to bypass security. The right thing to do is start with a culture saying security is here to help you. We are not going to do bad things to you. We are not going to force you to do things that you do not understand. We are here to assist you because you, Mr. Developer, you're accountable for the security. We are responsible helping you and making sure that you've got everything that you need in order to do that. And once you're educated and there is a certain bar, we want to make sure that nobody is doing faulty things just by mistake. And then we're going to place the guardrails once everybody knows and understands that this is not trying to harm them and not trying to slow them down. So it is a process. It takes time. We've accompanied a few companies that have done this journey from a new CISO coming in, getting the budget, creating the first events, and actually organizing the awareness program, implementing the tools. It requires a lot of time, but we've seen the developers in those companies saying, we own security. And you see them walking in the corridors with a hoodie saying, I'm part of the security team. And they're very proud to be that way. In places that they said, no, I'm just going to buy a tool and just throw it away and it will be okay, it doesn't work.
Yeah, so you said an important word. We own security. Engineering team says we own security, right? I mean, that implies a shift in accountability and potentially a shift in the model and way security is structured within large enterprises.
Yeah. The only thing that needs to work today.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Nathan was saying. when we want engineering teams to walk around with security hoodies, that comes with a lot of collaboration that the team has done from a security perspective with the engineering, right? You've translated user stories, you worked with them in the trenches, you've worked with them to reduce false positives, you've given them guardrails around what they can push and where they can enable themselves, self-service to an extent, versus, having policies and meetings and discussions. Those are all great and needed. Communication is needed, but it's the how that makes the difference. And that how is what reduces the friction and makes engineering wear their security hoodie and say, hey, I'm a security champion.
Yeah.
But yeah, and friction, I guess it's more conversation, right, than friction, right? You can have good conversation, you can have good solutions, you can come up to a good something, that makes sense. And once you get by that, then you can, truly be effective across everything. But it does take, does take training, does take commitment, does take work, right? And it's okay to have work, right? It takes work on both developer side and work on security side to get it right. And we have to kind of embrace the work that's necessary to get it done.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I think these are all amazing points. It's building that culture, it's building that trust, and because these teams are typically, they're not in line with the CISO. Typically, they have their business focused elements, and you have to build that kind of buy-in across the organization. That also means getting the buy-in from the C-level and ensuring that this is something that is being reinforced across the organization, the importance of it, because it only takes one team to be to be off on its own on this for things to go wrong. So really it has to be not just, building that culture from the ground up, but also having that air cover from the top. So if there are things that are not working and not aligned with that culture, there's those to help hold people to account. But yes, I think you can't just do it with accountability alone. You have to build that culture, that trust, and all of that. So I think these are great insights.
Yeah, so on the points of culture, education, awareness, I'm just going to read a couple of comments from the Q&A box before we conclude. And unfortunately, there's no time to discuss them, but I think they're great. So somebody says, most third-party risk management professionals are not engineers. We do not have the technical expertise to determine if software components are appropriate. I've been in TPRM for 10 years, and I've never heard the term SBOM.
Yeah, so we absolutely have an education model that needs to be in place, and we have to help the TPRM teams have an appropriate way to measure risk and rather risk with a company as opposed to the
understand it first and then measure it.
Yeah, so we have to help them. It is an education. I think we're seeing new technology to help. We're seeing other things that can help. But the collection of questionnaires is not kind of helping anybody right now. It's a checkbox that needs to get done. So as opposed to being able to have a good sense of the risk associated with a component, they really, in many cases, collecting data that's not getting looked at. So I think it is going to shift the TPRM function and the TPRM people into a little bit more, but that's going to take some time and some education.
Well, thank you, Tim.
Thank you for the comments.
Thank you all the panelists. I think it's been super interesting in the last hour for me personally. I hope it was for the audience as well. And with that, we're getting ready to wrap up.